Hey everybody! In this video, I'm going to talk about a walker that played a short but very prominent role in the history of Star Wars. If you like what I do on this channel, you can help us by donating, subscribing, or leaving a comment. It will really help to release videos on the Star Wars universe more often. The link to Patreon you will find in the description of this video. And now enjoy watching! We recently had a discussion about the necessity of using the AT-TE walker and the reasons why the Empire removed this vehicle from service and replaced it with other walkers, including the famous AT-AT. Anyway, if you are interested in the story about the Clone Army's main walker, then have a nice viewing. So, AT-TE. That acronym stands for All-Terrain Tactical Enforcer. The AT-TE was a hybrid of a tank and a heavy infantry fighting vehicle. This vehicle became a staple in the Grand Army of the Republic because of its versatility. AT-TEs transported clone infantrymen, supported them with fire, destroyed enemy fortifications and armored vehicles, and sometimes even disabled spaceships. Prior to the Clone Wars and during the war, factories produced AT-TEs at a rate of several 100,000 per year. By the end of the war, the AT-TE had become the most mass-produced heavy walker in the galaxy. The AT-TE participated in almost every battle of the Clone Wars. Because of the brief but intense combat biography of the AT-TE, it is hard to believe that the basis for the creation of this tank was a vehicle for the defense of mines and quarries. Such vehicles were used by some mining companies in remote regions of the galaxy to transport people and cargo, as well as to protect them from aggressive environment, predators, and intelligent attackers with blasters in their hands. Shortly before the start of the Clone Wars, the design of the ancestor of the AT-TE was urgently revised and a full-fledged combat vehicle was developed on its basis. The prototype of the future AT-TE and its finalization was created by the Rathana Heavy Engineering Company. All design work and tests were strictly classified. The beginning of large-scale production was also successfully classified. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine did not want to show the Separatists that the Old Republic was preparing a great army and would soon be able to fight back. Incidentally, skirmishes with the Separatists had been occurring even before the Clone Wars, although they had not yet managed to form a unified military and political alliance until 22 years before the Battle of Yavin. It's worth noting that the idea of ordering the walkers to Rathana was not Palpatine's or Dooku's. The Kaminoans made this choice. In the past, they had a good experience of cooperation with Rathana, because the Kaminoans had grown combat clones before in the interests of local governments and large corporations, although they had never had to grow soldiers and bodyguards in such huge numbers before. By the way, most often Kaminoans had to breed not soldiers, but simpler clones, basically willis slaves for heavy industries, domestic servants, and the like. Sometimes they were ordered to clone rare species of animals in order to preserve the population, though the latter was more often done by Arcanians. The Kaminoans didn't care who they cloned or why. Business is business. But back to AT-TE. The choice of the executor of the order was quite fortunate. Kuat Corporation, as well as its subsidiary company Rathana, were not friends with either the Trade Federation or the future Confederacy of Independent Systems, and this already allowed them to hope for secrecy of information. The secrecy was also aided by the cultural peculiarities of the Rothanians themselves, which made it difficult for the Trade Federation to engage in espionage. In order not to attract attention, AT-TE production was deployed in the bowels of huge underground factories of Rathana, as well as in the workshops of some orbital factories, and the final oddity of this order. Until the last moment, the Rathana leadership was sure that they were fulfilling the order not of Palpatine, but of the Kaminoans. They did not suspect that their war machines would soon fight on the side of the Galactic Republic in the biggest war of the last millennium. Apparently, the Rothanians were not particularly interested in what kind of army needed walking tanks. And the government of the Republic, represented by the Galactic Senate, didn't care who needed millions of units of various military equipment and for what purpose. Because of the corruption in the Galactic Republic, the senators were more interested in promoting the interests of their planets and systems only. Thanks to all this, the Kaminoan-grown clone army received a sufficient amount of combat and auxiliary equipment from the first days of the war, and the factories of Rathana gained such a pace that during the whole period of the war, the Grand Army of the Republic did not experience any shortage of armored vehicles. all losses were replenished with new vehicles in a timely manner. The bright and unforgettable debut of the AT-TE took place on the desert fields of Geonosis, where these tanks greatly influenced the achievement of victory. They easily broke the poorly organized resistance of the mechanized forces of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, inflicting tangible damage to the Separatists in equipment and infantry. The AT-TE and LA-8I accounted for the bulk of the Separatist heavy battle droids and tanks destroyed. Let me remind you that 2,160 AT-TE walkers fought in the battle on Geonosis. They were opposed by 15,000 DSD-1 Spider droids, 4,100 IG-227 Hailfire-class droid tanks, 7,500 OG-9 Spider droids, and several hundred AAT tanks. But even despite this clear numerical superiority, the clone tankers turned almost all of the Separatist equipment into scrap metal. What was the design of the AT-TE? The machine consisted of two separate modules connected by a flexible passage. The engine and generators were located in this passage. This design made the tank more maneuverable in confined spaces and gave it greater cross-country capability, allowing it to overcome wide ditches, trenches, faults, and other obstacles. Additional help in grip was provided by special grips on the legs of the vehicle. During the Battle of Teth, it was due to these technical solutions that the AT-TE tank platoon climbed a steep cliff, continuing the offensive in a vertical direction. The all-terrain capability came in handy many times in other combat situations as well. As a result, such a design, if a unit had a tank cannon and armor cover during combat in rugged terrain, was very effective in getting on the nerves of the enemy, who could count only on light small arms, mortars, and grenade launchers. In the case of the Separatist droid army, in the mountains they could only count on light cannons of various models of Spider droids. AAT tanks were difficult to drive into the mountains, although to be fair, it should be said that the AT-TE's paws could not grasp every surface. Where it was possible to put a paw and where it was impossible was determined by the onboard computer of the walker, processing data received from sensors and gauges on the feet of the machine, analyzing the state of the surface. Automation of this process simplified the control of the machine even at high speed. AT-TE could accelerate on a flat surface up to 60 kilometers per hour. However, in most tactical situations, the AT-TE did not need to travel at maximum speed. In addition to the above, the AT-TE had magnetic grippers on its feet, like on some army boots and spacesuit shoes. At first, it seemed that AT-TE, like other walkers, didn't really need magnetic grips, because they made sense only aboard a landing ship, to be more securely fixed on the deck. But the realities of the Clone Wars proved otherwise. The grips are necessary. Another advantage of the walker legs was the ability to penetrate planetary deflector shields, overcoming which has always been an insoluble problem for vehicles on a repulsor chassis. Remember the events of the first episode where AAT tanks could not engage the Gungans while the deflector shield projector was working. The droids were the first to storm the positions. During the second battle on Geonosis, shown in Episode 5 of second season of the Clone Wars animated series, AT-TE's ability to pass through the shield allowed them to destroy the artillery and, most importantly, the Separatists' shield projectors. In addition to this, the planetary shield interfered with landing troops. And when it is not there, the landing force can be landed anywhere, thus having tactical and strategic initiative on the battlefield. That was the end of the main phase of the battle. In addition, the legs of the tank, moved out of the vehicle dimensions, not only increased stability, but also provided better survivability of the crew and paratroopers in case of mine explosion. The explosion tore off the leg of the walker, but the products of the explosion did not penetrate into the troop compartment, although the lower part of the AT-TE was poorly armored. If a mine exploded directly under the underbody, the troop in the vehicle could be injured. The auxiliary armament of the AT-TE was represented by 6 Cuso Mod 21 anti-personnel rapid-fire laser cannons. 4 cannons are located at the front of the vehicle and 2 at the rear. The cannons are designed to engage infantry, lightly armored and unarmored vehicles. Each gun was mounted in a separate ball mount and had a large firing sector. This allowed not only to concentrate fire along the front, but also made it possible to hit in bursts enemy infantrymen who came up from the sides with grenades. The main weapon of the AT-TE was the Gazak Firefont Euro 4 mass driver gun. In the Star Wars universe, this is the name given to cannons that use non-energy artillery shells for firing. The cannon was reloaded by a belt-fed automatic loader. A belt of shells was stacked along the vehicle from above. Another belt was located in the bottom of the walker. It is not specified how exactly the clone gunner changed the type of projectile during firing with tape feeding. Interestingly, completing the shells in the ribbon was usually done manually by the crew. Given the location of the shells, it can be assumed that the crew spent a lot of time equipping the tank and were not very happy about it. As for the cannon itself, it is a fairly accurate and long-range gun used to hit almost all types of targets. The cannon could destroy long-term fortifications, hit infantry in the open and behind cover, destroy enemy tanks, large droids, and armored speeders. If necessary, the cannon could also be used to destroy air targets. The cannon's ammunition could include shaped charge, sub-caliber, fragmentation, sonic, and anti-bunker shells. They were used to destroy buildings and fortifications. There was a possibility of using corrected shells, which were guided by thermal radiation of the target. The long range of effective firing allowed the AT-TE to support the advancing troops from afar and to carry out artillery preparation, throwing shells by canopy without entering the range of the enemy's anti-tank guns. If necessary, the AT-TE could be armed with a laser or blaster gun. The AT-TE crew consisted of 7 clones. The mechanic driver sat in the front of the tank. The gunner, who was often the commander of the vehicle, was behind and slightly above the mech driver. Unlike the driver, who observed the terrain only through his helmet's visor, the commander had his own periscope with a built-in rangefinder and night vision device. The mechanic driver and commander entered the tank through the front section, which was hinged upwards. 4 of the 5 gunners were inside the walker, in the troop compartment. Their boarding in the AT-TE was carried out together with the troop, through the landing hatches in the sides of the vehicle. The gunner operating the main gun got to his workplace through the troop compartment by climbing the ladder and getting up through the hatch on the roof of the tank. The AT-TE could carry up to 20 soldiers with full armament inside. There was a modification of the AT-TE, which had seats for 10 soldiers in the front landing compartment and 2 AT-RT reconnaissance walkers in the second compartment. The tank of this modification for AT-RT landing had a ramp lift in the stern. Sometimes this modification was used for cargo transportation. The AT-RT was also used as a command and control vehicle, where one of the landing compartments housed a troop control center. In addition to the troopers, the AT-TE had a nest for an IM-6 model medical droid located in the aft compartment. The droid could not perform a full-fledged operation on the battlefield, but was capable of keeping the clone alive until evacuation arrived and the wounded were taken to a hospital. But in the harsh realities of war, medical droids did not live long, so almost most AT-TEs fought without a robotic medic. Infantry loading and unloading was done through 4 side hatches. This was a good decision. Firstly, through 4 hatches, the paratroopers could jump out in a few seconds. And secondly, it allowed the infantry to land from either side under the cover of armor. The troop compartments were fully pressurized and had life support systems in the stern. This allowed to stay inside the tank without helmets and other special equipment, even when behind the armor the terrain was poisoned by radiation, chemical weapons, or there was simply nothing to breathe on the planet due to natural features. The AT-TE's oxygen generator could provide crew survival for 3 weeks. It had a range of 500 kilometers when fully fueled. Quite decent for a vehicle that does not need to make long marches, unlike the tanks of the real world. Now it is worth mentioning the armor. The armor of the AT-TE made it invulnerable to the fire of light and heavy small arms, both handheld and stationary. The side and aft armor of the AT-TE could be penetrated only by powerful anti-tank grenade launchers, anti-tank guns, and rockets. For example, during the Battle of Ryloth, when Mace Windu's tank group was ambushed in a narrow mountain pass, the AT-TEs took numerous hits to the side from the guns of AAT tanks. In doing so, however, the Separatists failed to achieve a single armor piercing sufficient to incapacitate the walker. Windu's tank squad was only stopped when a Separatist tank hit one of the AT-TE's front legs. Because of this, the column was halted for a while. More or less vulnerable was the roof of the AT-TE, where the armor was thinner. If possible, the Separatists tried to shoot at the roof. Of the entire arsenal of anti-tank weapons of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, only the missiles of the wheeled droid IG-227 Firegrad were guaranteed to penetrate the armor of the AT-TE, which can be seen in the second episode of 2002. In addition to protection from standard weapons, the AT-TE's outer armor had electromagnetic protection, protecting the tank from ion weapons and electromagnetic bombs. The frontal projection defense was much worse. The transparasteel windows of the control compartment were easily penetrated by phaser cannons. It is not clear why the designers decided not to protect the crew with armor, because even in maneuver warfare most of the shots have to tank in the frontal projection. The tankers of the Grand Army of the Republic faced this problem many times, and after all, armored vehicles including tanks, both in our world and in the universe of Star Wars, not for nothing have enhanced protection in the frontal projection. The gunner of the main gun, for some strange reason, also decided not to cover with armor, which made him vulnerable even to fire from light small arms, and this place was nicknamed Suicide Nest. In the frontal projection, the gunner is slightly covered by the shield on the mask of the gun, but from the sides and from the back, he is protected only by faith in the Republican democracy. It is interesting that the gunners of light guns worked under the protection of armor. If the shortcoming of the turret gunner could still be eliminated by covering his working place with armor plates, the lack of protection in the frontal projection could not be eliminated. To deliver AT-TEs to the battlefield, the transport LAAT-I was created on the basis of the transport combat LAAT-C. The presence of these transports allowed to land tanks already in the first wave of landing without waiting for the infantry to seize a beachhead for landing large landing ships. But during the Clone Wars, LAAT-C were used to transport many types of combat vehicles of the Grand Army of the Republic and a variety of cargoes, including cargo containers and construction materials. It is worth noting that delivering AT-TE with LAAT-C was a dangerous endeavor. LAAT-C did not have good maneuverability and were very vulnerable to enemy anti-aircraft installations and various rapid-fire artillery, and for fighters, they were an easy target. By the way, in the Galactic Empire, walkers were usually landed by heavily armored landing craft. After the triumphant conclusion of the Clone Wars and the Republic's transformation into the Galactic Empire, AT-TE tanks continued to be in service with the new armed forces and used against the remnants of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. A few years after the war, when the Imperial Army began to receive new armored vehicles, many AT-TEs were decommissioned, sent to storage depots, and donated or sold to planets loyal to the Empire. The AT-TEs were replaced in the Imperial military by walkers and repulsor tanks of newer models. Some of the remaining AT-TEs were converted into armored repair and recovery vehicle and received a crane and other equipment for repair of vehicles in the field instead of the aft landing compartment. Another part of AT-TEs was converted into high cross-country trucks. For this purpose, the cannon, upper armor of the troop compartment, and passenger seats were removed from the AT-TE. This modification could be found on outer ring worlds and some core planets. In the turmoil of mass rearmament, some of the walkers were inevitably lost. They went to mercenaries, organized crime, and anti-government illegal armed groups. Many AT-TEs were found abandoned or shot down on the battlefields. They were then recovered and used. As an example, a Weequay gang were operating in the spaceport of the planet Sri Lure, as well as in the city and villages surrounding the spaceport. It is unclear where they managed to get AT-TE. The Weequay used the tank as a very powerful argument in disputes with rivals in the difficult bandit trade, to extort money from visiting free traders. In the crosshairs of a tank cannon, anyone would be ready to dialogue. The bandit feast of life continued until Han Solo and Chewbacca happened to be on Sri Lure. The pair of smugglers took out the rear legs of the walker with an anti-tank missile and quickly withdrew, not waiting for the offended Weequay to come to their senses. Although they had hit the tank, nothing prevented the Weequay from repairing the AT-TE and filling their wallets with the taken money again, disturbing those around them with the rumble of the walker's legs. The owner of the largest number of AT-TE walkers was, of course, the Rebel Alliance. But don't think that the Alliance could bring a whole armada of tanks to the planet. The Rebels rarely got around to using tanks because covert transportation of armored vehicles was not easy. The Rebels obtained walkers in every way possible. They took them as spoils of war, looted Imperial warehouses, bought them on the black market, and repaired them on the battlefield. But the rebels were not only using the old vehicles, they were actively modernizing them. Alliance Colonel Jenica Pierce was convinced that the Alliance's use of modernized ATTEs could fundamentally change the balance of power in ground battles with Imperial armor. She was wrong. Shortly after the Battle of Yavin, the upgraded ATTEs were used by the rebels in a strategic offensive against the Middle Ring worlds. For the Imperials, these self-propelled vehicles were no big problem. Apparently, the rebel ATTEs did not survive the Alliance's transformation into the New Republic, burning out in the battles of the Galactic Civil War. We can't help but mention the ATTE from the Rebels animated series, turned into a self-propelled house by veteran clones. It turned out to be very cozy. By the way, this house on legs was able to withstand several direct hits from the cannons of the early version of AT-AT. In the new canon, ATTEs were used by the Imperials during the Battle of Kuat, simultaneously with AT-ST, AT-AT, and its cargo version AT-AC. Interestingly enough, the Imperials decided to reinforce the defensive artillery of the orbital station ring of the Kuat shipyards with the Walker cannons. The Walkers became a kind of mobile anti-aircraft installations to protect the ring from fighters and bombers, as well as a means of fighting corvettes and gunboats. In the original Star Wars, after the death of the Emperor at the Battle of Endor and the beginning of the Empire's collapse, some Imperial commanders who lacked modern armor were forced to think of ATTs. They took ATTs out of storage warehouses, loaded them with shells and fuel, and sent them into battle. The most ATTs were in a small shard of the Empire that proudly called itself the Restored Empire. It was such a pathetic name for a group that was more like a cult. They believed in the sanctity of Emperor Palpatine. The shard existed from 4 to 13 years after the Battle of Yavin. It was led by Enix Devion, who used to run secret and dirty errands for the Emperor and Darth Vader. He had found a large number of ATTEs at his disposal after he and his supporters had found the Imperial Reserve depots where Clone Wars military hardware was stored just in case. Everything was there, including venators and acclamators. With all this hardware, Enix Devion had thwarted the New Republic in various ways. Devion was finally appeased by former guardsman Kirkanos by making a hole in him with a blade during the events on Orinda, and the army was soon dispersed by the New Republic and Imperials from another shard of the Empire. What was done with the remaining equipment, including the ATTE, history does not tell. More than once I have seen and heard claims that the Galactic Empire was wrong to abandon the ATTE, replacing it with the AT-AT and other walkers. Defenders of the ATTE point to the comparatively lower height of the vehicle, greater stability, much better cross-country capability, good defense, and the large number of anti-personnel weapons pointed in all directions. This is all true. And yes, indeed, AT-ATs are not without their shortcomings. Moreover, I personally never liked AT-ATs. Plus, the ATTE is much prettier on the outside. But ATTE has its own bouquet of irreparable flaws. The main ones, in my opinion, are the lack of a normal armored turret and poor protection of the control compartment with mechanic driver and commander. So, why was the ATTE discontinued? The Empire had combat vehicles of similar size with much better performance than the ATTE. The AT-MT was far superior to the ATTE in terms of cross-country capability and was more effective in rugged terrain and mountains. It climbed walls just as well. The ATTE niche in assault operations on flat terrain was successfully occupied by repulsor tanks and armored personnel carriers on Caterpillar and repulsor tracks. The ATTE was, albeit brief, a very bright page in the history of the Clone Wars and the post-war period. A worthy machine that was loved by the clones and the first Imperial stormtroopers for a reason. Thank you for watching the video. By the links in the description, you can support the channel, and see you soon!